I hate when I tune into a podcast and the host tells you that you're listening to part 2 of a 2-part episode. And if you have not listened to part 1, then turn the episode off and go find part 1. I always think that's nuts. It's so hard to get someone's attention. And then you're just going to send me away with a task, no less. Now I got to go find part 1. This episode is part of a 2-part topic, but you do not have to listen to one to enjoy the other, and you do not have to listen in any particular order. Part 1 is about the 5 reasons that I see in my practice lately where landlords still very much want to evict you from a rent-stabilized apartment, even after the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 made vacancy way less valuable to landlords. And part 2 is about the main way that landlords make those plays for your rent-stabilized apartment in the current environment, which is via non-primary residence and anti-successor cases, and what you can do to protect yourself from such cases. I just didn't want to make an hour-long episode because nobody likes those either. So I split this into 2 standalone topics. I weave them together in these 2 episodes. New York City tenants have more rights than tenants anywhere else in America, but New York City tenants are also shockingly uneducated about what those rights are. A right you don't know you have is the same as no right at all. That's what this podcast is here to fix. Come along with a lawyer who's been doing nothing but landlord-tenant law in New York City for 30 years and take a deep dive every episode into important recent cases and new laws. This show proudly covers stuff that is hard and boring, which is why nobody else is covering it. But it's what you need to know to protect your home, your money, and your peace of mind. The law belongs to you, New York City, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I am Michelle Itkowitz, and this is Learn to Live Better, a housing law podcast. First, as always, let's set the stage with some context. From about 1993 to 2019, a period of about 25 years, the way the rent stabilization law was set up gave landlords incredible incentive to promote tenant turnover. Vacancy had value. When a rent-stabilized tenant surrendered their apartment, 3 things could happen. The rent would automatically be increased by a big vacancy increase as much as 20%. The rent could be increased even more than the 20% if the landlord spent money actually improving the apartment. There was a formula for how much rent could increase depending on how much a landlord spent. And finally, if the rent legally increased enough during a vacancy, the apartment could be deregulated and go straight into the free market, where a landlord could forevermore charge whatever the market would bear, and they could evict whoever they wanted to at the end of a lease. On June 14th, 2019, the New York State Legislature passed the historic Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, the HSTPA, Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. And the HSTPA did all kinds of things that protected tenants, but one of the biggest things it did was it disincentivized landlords from pushing for vacancy, eliminated automatic vacancy increases, it greatly curtailed individual apartment improvement increases, and it eliminated high rent deregulation. So vacant, rent-stabilized apartments were no longer good news to most landlords. In fact, if a tenant vacates, often the landlord has to spend more money cleaning up the apartment for the next tenant than the landlord can make back over a very long period of time. After the HSTPA, New York City's rent-stabilized tenants and their advocates breathed a collective sigh of relief. But that was 7 years ago, and I think I am seeing a new trend. I'm getting a lot of calls from tenants whose landlords are suddenly suing to evict them for non-primary residence and or fighting their successors' claims to take their apartments. One of the requirements for rent stabilization protection is that you live in your rent stabilized apartment as your primary residence. Your rent stabilized apartment must be your primary residence. Now, what does that mean exactly? That's a big topic, and we will get into that in the next episode following this one, where we look closely at non-primary residence cases. But the important point for this episode is that landlords are using this non-primary residence an anti-successor thing to push for vacancy again. And our question in this episode is why? We're covering 5 reasons your landlord possibly still wants to evict you from your rent-stabilized apartment, even after the HSTPA of 7 years ago came along and made vacancy less economically valuable to a landlord. Number 1, if you are a non-purchasing rent-stabilized tenant in a co-op or a condo building. Let me explain how this works. When these buildings converted to co-ops and condos 30 to 40 years ago, most of them converted under what was called a non-eviction plan, which meant that all tenants living there who did not want to buy their apartments could remain as rent-stabilized tenants. But when they leave, the apartment's owner, often still the sponsor of the conversion, they can sell the apartment just like a regular co-op or condo and make a lot of money on it. Interesting fact, there are speculators out there who own hundreds of these non-purchasing tenant co-op and condo apartments. They buy them from the conversion sponsor for cheap, and then they wait. They wait for the rent-stabilized tenants to die or leave, hopefully without successors. So there's a whole industry in these units. Your apartments, therefore, if you are a non-purchasing tenant, a non-purchasing rent-stabilized tenant in a co-op or condo, still have tremendous value to whoever owns the deed or the shares to your apartment. And those landlords will be happy the day you leave. Number 2, if you are only rent stabilized because of a 421A tax break that has expired, but you remained rent stabilized because of a leasing deficit. I'm going to break it down. 421A, that's the short name for a law. 421A was a tax abatement for new construction projects. So the developer gets a tax break from the government and the government gets new housing. But as part of the deal, the landlord has to treat the tenants in the new building as rent stabilized at least until the tax benefit expires, which can be anywhere from 10 to 30 years. I often see 15. The rule, however, is that the landlord needs to inform the tenants that this type of rent stabilization is not forever. Every new lease and every renewal form must have a very particular special rider that warns the tenant when the rent stabilization status is going to go away with the tax abatement. That is very important. It's right in the statute, both the rent stabilization law and the real property tax law. Many landlords over the years forgot these riders or did these 421A riders wrong. The result, such tenants may remain in their apartments as rent stabilized tenants until they are ready to leave. And that obviously can be decades. It can be a whole lifetime. But when tenants in these types of apartments leave, in most cases, the apartment is then free market. You have to understand, most of these buildings that we're talking about here were built after 2009, so they don't become covered by the good cause eviction law. Therefore, these units are purely free market and extremely valuable to landlords. I just did a rent stabilization due diligence for a building that had 4 units like this in it. So those 4 units, to a landlord's eyes, look like opportunity. So if you are rent stabilized only because of a tax abatement, you should also exercise a little extra vigilance. Number 3, another reason the landlord might still want your rent stabilized apartment, even in the wake of the HSTPA where vacancy has less value, is if the landlord thinks it can rent your unit out for commercial purposes. So here's the thing. The price per square foot of residential real estate is almost always higher than the price per square foot of commercial real estate. Yes, commercial rents are higher than residential rents, but that's because commercial spaces are bigger. But landlords generally make more money on residential than commercial because the actual price of the physical space is higher in residential than commercial on a per square foot basis. Therefore, most landlords would not want to transition residential real estate into commercial real estate. In fact, after the pandemic taught half of us that we very much do not need to spend 3 hours a day commuting places to get our work done, which is almost exclusively done on a computer or phone. There has been a trend of converting office buildings into housing, and I've been proud to have been part of some of those projects to create more housing from office buildings. However, when you have the HSTPA killing almost any value in vacancy, and then you have a rent freeze, as we do right now, 0% for a 1 year, 0% for a 2 year. That kind of thing, whether the powers that be intended or not, makes owners revisit the transition to commercial idea. And it may not look so bad. A landlord to do this properly would have to change the building certificate of occupancy. And to legally do that is not a small thing, but it's not impossible either. So tenants who should be a little more vigilant about the landlord looking cavaciously at their apartments for possible conversion to commercial use are anybody who is living in a ground floor or parlor floor apartment. The closer to the street it is, the more likely it could be turned into commercial. Anybody with an apartment in a mixed use building. So there's already commercial units in your building, especially if your unit is contiguous with, touching the commercial unit. So you're right above the commercial unit, you're behind the commercial unit, because then there's always the fear that your space could be more valuable to the landlord if it was absorbed into the commercial space that it adjoins. Anybody in brownstones on commercial avenues, and anybody in a residential neighborhood where there's a very strong market for localized services like therapy practices, wellness businesses, or art studios. Number 4, the reason your landlord might want to recover your apartment, even after the HSTPA has caused vacancy to not have as much value. And that is if your landlord is just evil. And as I always say on here, most landlords are good people. Most landlords are not evil, but some are. So if your landlord is a rule breaker, a risk taker, they intend to rent it to rich foreigners who are not in New York City forever and who have never even heard of rent stabilization. And if they heard of it, they wouldn't care. Again, certainly not most landlords, but these people are out there. I feel like people who have been in the space for decades and understand it don't take these risks, but you still get these people that are coming into the space like cowboys, and they just want to run roughshod over everybody. And they're seduced by a multifamily building whose price is now half of what it used to be because of the HSTPA and the rent freeze and the foreclosures and all the things going on that are bad for multifamily. So the price of multifamily is very low. So what you get is people who say, well, that must be an opportunity. This building was worth twice this 10 years ago. I want to get in on this. And then they think, well, how am I going to get those rents up for my investors? The 5th reason that your landlord might still want to take over your rent stabilized apartment, even though they know they can't rent it for much more, and it doesn't make economic sense after the HSTPA. The 5th reason is if your landlord is someone who really does want to live in your apartment. Follow me here. Couples in their 30s, New Yorkers, had the dream job for many years. They've probably gone to one of the really great New York City high schools. They went to great colleges. They got the great New York City corporate job. They worked hard for years and they had their wedding. They're starting to have kids and they have enough money for a very decent McMansion in Long Island or someplace in Westchester, or they have a yard in New Jersey, but they want to remain in New York City. They are New Yorkers. They grew up in New York. Their family might be first generation New Yorkers, first generation Americans, and they're successful and they want to take their money and invest in the city that they grew up in. So they are seeing the same rock bottom prices on these multifamily buildings. And they say to themselves, for the same amount I could buy a McMansion, I could buy a 6 to 10 unit building and live in a great neighborhood. And if I take back at least 2 of those units for me and my family, that'll be great. I'm neutral on this one because I just have to say this. I think it can be a good thing for New York when a landlord lives in its own building as opposed to a mansion on Long Island. When I started in this business in the mid 1990s, you still saw landlords who lived in their own buildings, and the building never lost heat because the landlord's family would go cold. And the building was never not secure because the landlord's kids were growing up there. And if the tenant had a baby, the landlord went to the tenant's christening. And I'm not talking about these types of landlords trying to take the apartment back by what's known as an owner's use case, because that was all but eliminated with the HSTPA. It still exists, but the bar is very high. I've only even heard of one case, I think, in the last 7 years. Here again, I'm talking about landlords who are looking for opportunities that you might present them with to unseat you from your apartment. Again, all of this is about why a landlord would still want your unit, even though they can't legally charge more for it. And these are the reasons. And this is going to lead to some fascinating takeaways. That's what we're doing next. Let's get the housekeeping out of the way. This isn't legal advice. I'm not your lawyer, but because I am a lawyer, this might be considered legal advertising. If it's legal advertising, it's terrible because I'm asking you not to contact me. This podcast is not a commercial for me or my law firm. This is simply one of the podcasts that I always wanted to make. What I would like to hear from you on is what topics you'd like me to cover. My email's in the show notes. It's time for the tenant takeaway. Tenant takeaway time. Tenant takeaway number 1. Again, most of my episodes are based on a new case or a new law, and I extract a lesson therefrom. But occasionally, an episode is simply this. It's just me teaching you something that I think you need to know. And I'm seeing an uptick in non-primary residence cases and challenges to successors. And I was thinking about why. And these other trends that I'm giving you in this episode occurred to me about why a landlord still wants to recover an apartment even 7 years after the HSTPA has made vacancy way less attractive. So the first takeaway is that landlords are more likely to make a play for your apartment if there is any hiatus on you living in the apartment. If you're in your apartment 365 days of the year, maybe you leave a week or 2 weeks for vacation, you don't have to worry about this. But if you go away for a long time for work, to care for a sick relative, to travel, you could be a target for a non-primary residence case. Now, I'm absolutely not saying that you can't do things and keep your rent stabilized apartment. I'm not saying that you can't travel for work. I am not saying that you can't go away to care for a sick relative. I'm not saying you can't just travel, have a second home for just vacation purposes. I'm not saying any of that. And that's what we're going to cover in the next episode. But what I am saying is that how you do these things can make all the difference in the world. And again, that's what we're covering in the non-primary residence episode, because I've written a 29-page booklet on how to protect your apartment from non-primary residence and successor challenges. And it contains everything anybody on the planet needs to know to protect their apartment from a non-primary residence case or a challenge to succession. And we're covering that in the next episode. Takeaway number 2 is just simply to remain vigilant. Do not take your rent stabilized apartment for granted. When people call me after the landlord refuses to renew their lease for non-primary residence, they almost are always angry. In addition to being scared, they're angry. They feel betrayed. They're betrayed by the system that promised them stability. They're betrayed by the landlord. They're betrayed by the old landlord who just sold it to some new landlord. They're betrayed by their neighbors who maybe threw them under the bus and told the landlord they weren't in the apartment all the time. They're betrayed by the super who they think told on them. People in these situations thought they were safe, and they find out they're not. And here's the thing. A rent-stabilized apartment is not a right. If it was a right, then nearly every New Yorker would have one, and every New Yorker does not have one. A rent-stabilized apartment is a privilege, and it comes with rules. And if your landlord wants the apartment, and if your landlord has any reason to suspect that you're breaking the rules, well, put those two things together and you could end up with a case challenging your apartment. I do not want to scare you and eliminate your sense of security, but neither is anybody served by a sense of entitlement. Oh, I've lived here for 25 years. I think I'll go to Europe for 2 years and sublet my apartment without telling the landlord. Well, that can be a problem. And that needs to be thought through and approached methodically. Again, that's why we're taking a deep dive in the next episode on non-primary residence. But for our purposes now, the second takeaway is don't get complacent about your rent-stabilized apartment. It's too big a part of your life. Be vigilant, not paranoid, but responsible and vigilant. Tenant takeaway number 3. Trouble is most likely to happen when your building is in motion, when the building is purchased by a new owner, or when the building gets a new management company. This is especially the time to be vigilant. Tenant takeaway number 4, advocate for yourself. I represent a wonderful gentleman, a tenant in a rent stabilized unit, and some potential owners were touring the building considering buying it, actually a couple. This tenant was gracious enough to let the potential buyers walk through his apartment. And as they were walking through, the tenant could tell that these prospective purchasers were discussing what they would be doing with his apartment. How atrocious is that behavior? When new owners or managers plan to de-tenant as many units as possible, they don't attack everyone at once because they don't want the building to organize. And as I have said to this audience many times, the number one thing you can do to protect your home and your community is to organize. I have a show written on how to organize your building in 7 easy steps, but I never get around to recording it. Something's holding me back. I got to work on that one this summer. New owners and managers are trying to figure out what units to set their sights on recovering. And by being a good advocate for yourself from the very beginning, you can perhaps help the landlord not choose your apartment. You can do that by being direct, clear, firm, professional, and polite. If you see a new landlord coming and you're like, oh, every time this building changes hands, we all get hassled. It's terrible. It's a disaster. If you get angry and combative, all that signals to a landlord or a manager is that you're defensive. Maybe you have something to hide. You're scared. Anger and obstreperousness, that signals weakness. So be clear with the landlord that you have zero intention of vacating your home of X number of years, but be polite, professional, and perfectly clear. Tenant takeaway number 4 was be perfectly clear you're not going anywhere. And tenant takeaway number 5 is unless you are. So right after the HSTPA, I had a lot of tenants calling me upset because part of their retirement plan was to get a buyout of their rent stabilized apartment from a landlord. A buyout is when the landlord pays you to leave. Before the HSTPA in 2019, it often worked like this. So if the landlord could get $1,000 more per month for your apartment if you left, that means the landlord would make an additional $12,000 a year, or over 5 years, $60,000. If the landlord needed to spend $20,000 in improvements to get to that $1,000 increase in rent, then the landlord stood to make up to $40,000 over the next 5 years on your unit. Thus, it might make sense to pay you $20,000 to leave. If a landlord could get $2,000 more a month for your apartment if you left, because your unit was on the threshold of an organic deregulation without the landlord needing to spend anything, then that would mean that the landlord would make an additional $24,000 a year. So over 5 years, do the math, it's $125,000. Thus, it might make sense for that landlord to pay that tenant $60,000 to leave. That kind of thing. It's very hard to negotiate these types of situations without a lawyer. I would recommend that you have a lawyer for a buyout. But the point is, if units have value again, you know what? I just thought of that as I'm recording this. That's probably why I'm getting more calls from tenants who want help with buyouts. Yeah. The point is, there's a play being made for these apartments again, and it's made most powerfully with people who aren't in the apartment all the time, because that gives the landlord an entryway to start messing with you. And so that's why I've written this excellent 29-page booklet on how to protect your apartment from a non-primary residence or anti-successor claim. And that book is up, by the way. It's on my law firm website. Well, I'll put a link in the show notes, and it's free. I'm not trying to sell anything, so it's completely free. You don't even need to give your email address to download it. It's there. And there you have it. Remember, New York City, the law belongs to you, but your ownership of the law is only as great as your understanding of the law. So let's learn to live better. I'm Michelle Itkowitz, and this is Learn to Live Better, a housing law podcast.